Blue flashing lights sliced through a torrential downpour, illuminating the sheer panic in a young woman's eyes. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Chloe Henderson, a specialized pediatric cardiac nurse, but pure adrenaline masked her fatigue. Heavy metal handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrists as a smug, power-hungry police officer smirked, entirely convinced he had just secured a major drug trafficking bust. He ignored her frantic, tearful pleas. He mocked her hospital scrubs. Minutes later, the heavy doors of the police precinct would swing open, and that arrogant smile would dissolve into pure, unadulterated terror. Karma does not just knock. Sometimes, it kicks the door completely off its hinges. Rain lashed against the windshield of the police cruiser in angry, unrelenting sheets. Route 119, usually a busy artery feeding into downtown Seattle, was completely desolate at 2 in the morning. Inside the cruiser, Officer Bradley Jenkins drummed his thick fingers against the steering wheel. At 34 years old, Bradley was a deeply bitter man. 7 years on the force, twice passed over for detective, and currently riding out a shadow of probation, following a series of excessive force complaints that Internal Affairs had barely managed to sweep under the rug. He was a man desperately searching for a win, a high-profile bust that would force his superiors to finally give him the respect and the promotion he firmly believed he deserved. Bradley harbored a deeply ingrained cynicism, one that often bled into toxic prejudice. He viewed the citizens he was sworn to protect, not as people, but as suspects waiting to be caught. Tonight, his foul mood was exacerbated by the bitter cold, and the fact that his shift was supposed to end an hour ago. A sudden blur of silver cut through the darkness, pulling Bradley from his resentful thoughts. It was a late-model Honda Civic, its tires kicking up massive waves of water as it tore down the slick asphalt. Bradley's radar gun chirped rapidly. The vehicle was doing 75 in a 45 zone. "Gotcha," Bradley whispered to the empty cruiser, a predatory grin stretching across his face. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, flipping on the sirens and the blinding red and blue strobe lights. The cruiser surged forward, an apex predator giving chase in the dead of night. Inside the silver Honda, 28-year-old Chloe Henderson gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, mirroring the chaotic thrum of the windshield wipers. Chloe was a senior transport and stabilization nurse for Seattle Presbyterian's elite pediatric cardiology unit. Tonight, she wasn't supposed to be on duty. She had been at home, recovering from a grueling 14-hour shift, when her phone rang with the emergency code. A donor heart had miraculously become available for an 8-year-old girl who had been lingering at the very top of the transplant list for months. However, due to the severe weather grounding the usual medical transport helicopters, the logistics had descended into absolute chaos. The heart was being rushed by a specialized ground team from Portland, but the highly volatile, experimental anti-rejection enzymes and the proprietary cardioplegia solution required to keep the donor organ viable during the final stages of the transplant were locked in a secure lab facility across town. Chloe, the only senior staff member with the clearance and the precise training to handle and prepare the compounds, had been dispatched to retrieve them and rush them to the surgical theater. Every single second ticking by was the difference between a little girl's life and death. When the flashing police lights flooded her rearview mirror, Chloe's stomach plummeted into her shoes. She glanced at the digital clock on her dashboard. 2:14 a.m. The surgery was scheduled to begin at 2:30 a.m. She could not afford this delay. She immediately hit her blinker and pulled over to the muddy shoulder of the road, her hands visibly trembling as she rolled down the window. The freezing rain immediately blew into the car, soaking the sleeve of her blue hospital scrubs. Bradley parked his cruiser at an aggressive angle, intentionally boxing her in. He took his time stepping out into the storm, adjusting his utility belt and resting his right hand heavily on the butt of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic he used universally. He walked up to the driver's side window, shining his heavy-duty tactical flashlight directly into Chloe's eyes, blinding her. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Right now, Bradley barked over the roar of the rain, his voice dripping with inherent hostility. "Officer, please, I am so sorry I was speeding," Chloe pleaded, squinting against the harsh beam of light. "I am a medical transport nurse for Seattle Presbyterian. I have an absolute emergency. I didn't ask for your life story, lady. I asked for your license, Bradley interrupted sharply, shining the light down onto her lap and then sweeping it across the interior of the car. His beam stopped abruptly on the passenger seat. Resting securely on the seat was a heavy-duty reinforced medical lockbox, insulated and displaying several bright yellow biohazard and chemical warning stickers. Beside it sat a smaller, unlabeled black duffel bag. Bradley's eyes narrowed. In his mind, he didn't see a nurse. He saw a young, frantic black woman driving alone in the middle of the night, speeding recklessly, with a suspicious locked container riding shotgun. To an officer desperately hunting for a career-making drug bust, the narrative wrote itself almost instantly. "What's in the box?" Bradley demanded, his tone dropping an octave, shifting from annoyed traffic cop to interrogator. "It's a specialized cardioplegia solution and a series of experimental immunosuppressants," Chloe explained rapidly, the panic rising in her throat. She reached toward her center console. "My hospital ID is right here in my purse. I can show you." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Bradley roared, drawing his weapon half an inch from its holster. The sheer aggression in his voice froze Chloe in place. "Do not reach for anything." "I'm not," Chloe cried out, tears of frustration mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "Officer, listen to me. There is a child waiting on an operating table right now. If I don't get these medications to Seattle Presbyterian in the next 15 minutes, a little girl is going to die. Please, you can escort me. Follow me to the hospital. Run your sirens, please." Bradley scoffed, a cruel, dismissive sound that cut through the storm. "Yeah, I've heard every excuse in the book. I'm rushing to the hospital. My wife is in labor. My kid is dying. You people always use the same pathetic lines. Step out of the vehicle. You can't do this," Chloe screamed, genuine terror for the young patient taking over. "Call dispatch. Call Dr. Arthur Pendleton at Seattle Presbyterian. He will verify everything I am telling you," I said. "Step out of the damn vehicle," Bradley shouted, ripping the door handle open. He reached in, grabbed Chloe by the shoulder of her scrubs, and hauled her out into the freezing downpour. The sheer force of Bradley's pull sent Chloe stumbling onto the wet pavement. She scraped her knees against the rough asphalt, the cold rain instantly soaking her to the bone. Before she could even process the physical pain, Bradley had violently spun her around, slamming her chest against the side of her own car. "Spread your legs. Hands on the roof," he ordered, kicking her feet apart. "You are making a catastrophic mistake." Chloe sobbed, turning her head to look at him, her wet hair plastered to her face. "Check the box. It's temperature controlled. If the seal is broken improperly, the compounds will degrade. A child will literally die on an operating table." "Shut your mouth," Bradley hissed. He aggressively patted her down, finding nothing but a cell phone in her scrub pocket. He grabbed her wrists, pulling them behind her back with excessive force, and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around them. He clicked them tight, too tight, the metal biting painfully into her skin. He marched her over to the back of his cruiser, opened the door, and shoved her unceremoniously into the hard plastic back seat. He slammed the door shut, locking her in the claustrophobic, dimly lit cage. Through the rain-streaked window, Chloe watched in absolute horror as Bradley walked back to her Honda. He didn't go to her purse to check her ID. He went straight to the passenger side door. He opened it and stared at the medical lockbox. "No, no, no, please God, no." Chloe prayed silently, straining against the cuffs. Bradley leaned into the car. He examined the lockbox. The biohazard stickers and chemical warnings meant absolutely nothing to him. In the underground drug trade he was used to dealing with, traffickers frequently used fake medical transport boxes to move massive quantities of liquid fentanyl, methamphetamine precursors, and highly concentrated synthetic opioids. To Bradley, this was the motherlode. This was his detective shield waiting to be collected. He noticed the digital lock on the front of the box. Instead of asking for the code, he grabbed his heavy tactical flashlight and violently smashed the handle of it against the locking mechanism. Inside the cruiser, Chloe screamed in despair, though the soundproofed partition muffled her voice entirely. With a loud crack, the plastic casing of the lock shattered. Bradley pried the box open. Cold vapor immediately spilled out into the humid air. Inside, Nestled in precisely molded foam were 4 large glass vials of clear, slightly viscous liquid, alongside several blister packs of large, unlabeled white pills. The vials were marked with complex chemical formulas and the words proprietary, Cedal Presbyterian Registry. Bradley pulled one of the cold vials out, holding it up to the light of his flashlight. He smiled. He didn't know what kind of synthetic liquid this was, but there was enough of it here to put this woman away for a minimum of 20 years. He tossed the vial carelessly back into the cooler, barely missing the edge of the glass, and grabbed the black duffel bag. Inside, he found Chloe's stethoscope, some basic medical supplies, and several thick stacks of cash, nearly $2,000. It was Chloe's emergency savings that she was taking to the bank the next morning to pay for her mother's nursing home care. But to Bradley, it was the definitive proof of a drug deal. Cash and unlabeled chemicals. The holy grail of a narcotics bust. He swaggered back to the cruiser, thoroughly soaked but completely impervious to the cold. Fueled by a massive surge of egotistical adrenaline, he opened the front door and slid into the driver's seat, wiping the water from his face. Well, 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 Nurse Henderson, Bradley mocked, glancing at her through the wire mesh of the partition. Looks like your little hospital run is canceled. That is a massive quantity of Schedule I narcotics you've got in there. Combined with the cash, you're looking at intent to distribute, trafficking, and reckless endangerment. It's not narcotics, Chloe shrieked, kicking the back of his seat in absolute panic. It is tacrolimus and a specialized myocardial preservation solution. Look at my ID. Call the hospital. It is 2:22 a.m. The donor heart is arriving. Without those vials, the surgeon cannot perform the bypass safely. You are committing murder right now. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Look at my hospital badge. Save the performance for the public defender. Bradley sneered, completely shutting out her words. He put the cruiser in drive. You drug mules are getting incredibly creative. I'll give you that. The scrub routine, the fake cooler, almost had me, but I've been doing this too long to be played by street trash like you. I am a registered nurse, Chloe screamed, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face as the horrific reality set in. The little girl, the 8-year-old girl who had waited over a year for a heart. She was lying on a sterile table right now, her chest prepped, her family praying in the waiting room, and the only thing that could save her was sitting in the rain-soaked Honda Civic being left behind on the shoulder of Route 119. Officer Jenkins, please. My name is Chloe Henderson. Look me up in your computer. Call dispatch. Call someone. Anyone. Bradley reached forward and turned the volume up on his police radio, deliberately drowning out her frantic pleas. He grabbed his radio mic. Dispatch. This is Unit 4. Bravo. I am 10 to 15 with one female suspect. We have a massive seizure of unknown liquid narcotics and a large sum of cash. I am transporting the suspect to the 42nd precinct now and calling for an impound of the suspect's vehicle. Copy that 4. Bravo. The dispatcher crackled back. Bradley grinned at his reflection in the rearview mirror. This was it. The bust that would make his career. He drove away, leaving Chloe's car and the fragile, life-saving compounds inside it abandoned in the freezing storm. In the back seat, Chloe collapsed against the hard plastic, sobbing uncontrollably, mourning the death of a child she had sworn an oath to protect, a death caused by the sheer, staggering arrogance of the man sitting in the front seat. The 42nd precinct was a dreary, brightly lit fortress of concrete and worn linoleum flooring. Despite the late hour, the precinct was humming with the low, steady energy of night shift bureaucracy. Bradley Jenkins marched Chloe through the heavy double doors, his hand gripping her bicep tightly enough to leave bruises. Chloe was a devastating sight. Her blue scrubs were entirely saturated, clinging to her freezing frame. Her hair was a tangled, wet mess, and her face was pale and streaked with mascara and tears. Her wrists were raw and bleeding slightly from the friction of the tight handcuffs. She had stopped screaming during the drive. Now, she was trapped in a state of traumatized, hollow shock. It's too late, her mind repeated in a devastating loop. It's 2:40 a.m. The window for the tissue preservation is closing. It's over. Bradley paraded her past the bullpen, making sure the other night shift officers saw his prize. He strutted up to the high desk where Desk Sergeant Thomas Miller sat. Miller was a 25-year veteran, a gray-haired, pragmatic man who had absolutely zero patience for Bradley's cowboy antics. "What do we have, Jenkins?" Sergeant Miller sighed, not looking up from his paperwork. "The biggest collar of the month, Sarge," Bradley boasted loudly, ensuring the detectives at the nearby desks could hear him. "Pulled her over for reckless driving on 119. Suspect was acting highly erratic, clearly under the influence of her own supply. Found a massive stash of unlabeled liquid narcotics, looks like synthetic fentanyl precursors, stashed in a fake biohazard cooler, along with a couple grand in loose cash. She tried to play the 'I'm a nurse rushing to the hospital' card." Sergeant Miller finally looked up. He took one look at Chloe. He didn't see a hardened drug mule. He saw a deeply traumatized woman wearing legitimate, embroidered Seattle Presbyterian scrubs. He saw the genuine, soul-crushing despair in her eyes. "Name?" Miller asked softly, addressing Chloe. "Chloe Henderson," she whispered, her voice a broken rasp. "I am the senior transport nurse for pediatric cardiology at Seattle Presbyterian. My ID is in my purse, which he left in my car." Miller frowned, his seasoned instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. "Jenkins, did you run her name through the system before bringing her in?" "Didn't need to, Sarge." "Caught her red-handed with the product," Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes. "She's just sticking to her script. It's pathetic." "Uncuff her," Miller ordered, his voice hardening. "Sarge, she's a flight risk," I said. "Uncuff her, Jenkins. Now." Grumbling under his breath, Bradley pulled his keys and unlocked the heavy steel bracelets. Chloe immediately brought her arms forward, wincing as blood circulation returned to her raw wrists. She leaned heavily against the booking desk, her legs trembling. "Ma'am, you are entitled to one phone call," Miller said, sliding a heavy black landline phone across the counter toward her. "Do you want to call a lawyer?" "I don't need a lawyer," Chloe sobbed, grabbing the receiver with shaking hands. "I need to call my chief of surgery. I need to tell him." Her voice broke completely. "I need to tell him why his patient is going to die tonight." Bradley let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Give it a rest, lady." "The Oscar goes to—" "Shut up, Jenkins," Miller snapped, the authority in his voice echoing sharply across the room. Several officers in the bullpen stopped typing and turned to watch the exchange. Chloe dialed a number from memory. She put the phone on speaker, her hands shaking too violently to hold the receiver to her ear. The line rang twice before it was picked up. "Chloe? Where the hell are you?" A frantic, booming voice erupted from the speaker. It was Dr. Arthur Pendleton. "The helicopter from Portland just touched down on the roof. We have the heart. Where are the preservation enzymes? We cannot put this child on the bypass machine without the cardioplegia solution. Are you almost here?" Bradley's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked at the phone, then at Chloe. "Dr. Pendleton." Chloe wept, the sound of her heartbreak absolute. "I'm so sorry. I'm at the 42nd Police Precinct. I was pulled over. The officer. He wouldn't look at my ID. He smashed the lockbox open. He left it in my car on Route 119. The compounds, the thermal seal, is broken. It's gone, Arthur. I'm so sorry." Dead silence fell over the precinct. The sound of typewriters and quiet chatter vanished entirely. Every single police officer in the room froze. "What?" "Doctor." Pendleton's voice dropped to a horrifying, trembling whisper. "Chloe, tell me you are joking. Tell me you are walking through the emergency room doors right now." "I'm at the police station, Arthur," she cried. "Who arrested you?" Dr. Pendleton roared, his voice suddenly filled with a terrifying apocalyptic rage. "Who is the officer?" Before Chloe could answer, the heavy double doors of the precinct violently burst open. The glass panes shuddered upon impact. Standing in the doorway, soaked in rain, his trench coat completely drenched, was Police Commissioner Richard Hayes. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed state troopers. The commissioner's face was not flushed with anger. It was drained of all color, pale as a ghost, an expression of utter, unimaginable terror. Commissioner Hayes was a terrifyingly powerful man in Seattle, known for his ruthless efficiency and ironclad command of the police force. But right now, he didn't look like a commissioner. He looked like a father watching his world end. "Where is she?" Commissioner Hayes bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls like thunder. "Where is the transport nurse?" Sergeant Miller stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. "Commissioner." "She's right here, sir." Hayes sprinted across the room, ignoring every officer who stood at attention. He stopped in front of Chloe. He looked at her wet scrubs, the bruising on her wrists, and the devastation on her face. The medications. Hayes choked out, grabbing the edge of the booking desk to physically support himself. "Please, God. Tell me. You have them." "I don't," Chloe whispered, pointing a trembling finger directly at Bradley Jenkins. "He broke the thermal seal. He left them in my car on Route 119. They are compromised." Commissioner Hayes slowly, agonizingly, turned his head to look at Officer Bradley Jenkins. The silence in the room was so profound, so suffocating, that Bradley could hear his own rapid heartbeat thudding in his ears. The smug arrogance that had defined him just 10 minutes ago evaporated into thin air, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread that seeped into his very marrow. "Commissioner," Bradley stammered, taking a small step backward. His hands held up defensively. "Sir, I thought it was a narcotics run. She was speeding. I was just doing my job, following protocol." "Protocol?" Hayes whispered. The word sounded like a death sentence. The commissioner stepped toward Bradley, closing the distance until they were inches apart. The absolute hatred radiating from Hayes was palpable. "Do you have any idea whose heart is waiting in that operating room, Officer Jenkins?" Bradley swallowed hard, his throat entirely dry. He couldn't speak. He shook his head. "My daughter," Commissioner Hayes said, a single tear cutting through the rainwater on his face. "My 8-year-old daughter, Madison. She has been waiting 14 months for a heart. Tonight was her only chance. And you." Hayes's voice cracked, dropping to a guttural snarl. "You just killed her." In that exact, horrifying second, the absolute gravity of the situation crashed down upon Bradley Jenkins like a collapsing building. The drugs weren't drugs. The cash was irrelevant. He hadn't just wrongfully arrested a nurse. He had single-handedly sabotaged the life-saving surgery of the police commissioner's little girl. His career wasn't just over. His life as he knew it had just violently ended, and the nightmare was only just beginning. The silence inside the 42nd precinct was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that follows a bomb detonation, right before the screaming begins. Officer Bradley Jenkins stood completely paralyzed, his mind unable to bridge the gap between his perceived triumph and the catastrophic reality crashing down upon him. He looked at Commissioner Richard Hayes, a man who possessed the power to end careers with a single phone call, now reduced to a trembling, heartbroken father. "Commissioner, Bradley's voice was a pathetic squeak, devoid of the aggressive bravado he had wielded on the highway just 20 minutes prior. "I swear to God, the box looked suspicious. She was speeding. It's standard operating procedure to investigate." "Standard operating procedure?" Hayes erupted, his grief violently transmuting into unadulterated rage. He lunged forward, grabbing Bradley by the collar of his wet uniform, slamming him backward into the booking desk. "Standard operating procedure is to verify identification. Standard operating procedure is to listen when a medical professional tells you a life is on the line. You arrogant, incompetent fool. You broke the thermal seal on a proprietary medical transport." Several officers instinctively stepped forward to intervene, but a single, lethal glare from the state troopers flanking the commissioner froze them in their tracks. Nobody was going to save Bradley Jenkins. "Sergeant Miller," Hayes barked, not taking his eyes off Bradley. "Sir," Miller responded immediately, standing at strict attention. "Strip this man of his badge and his firearm." "Right now," Hayes commanded, his voice shaking with a terrifying, cold fury. "He is suspended without pay, effective immediately, and as of this exact second, he is under arrest for reckless endangerment, official misconduct, and interference with emergency medical services. "You can't do this," Bradley protested weakly, his eyes darting frantically around the bullpen, pleading for backup from his fellow officers. Every single one of them looked away. He was radioactive. "I have union representation. I have rights." "Read him his rights as you lock him in a holding cell," Hayes growled, shoving Bradley away in pure disgust. "And Sergeant, dispatch a heavily armed tactical unit to Route 119, mile marker 42. Secure the civilian vehicle and the medical transport box. Do not let anyone touch it until the hazmat and medical retrieval teams arrive. Now." As Sergeant Miller moved swiftly to disarm a stunned and hyperventilating Bradley, Commissioner Hayes turned his attention back to Chloe. The anger vanished from his face, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "Miss Henderson." "Chloe," Hayes said, his voice breaking. He gently placed his hands on her shivering shoulders. "Is there any chance? If the troopers get there in the next 5 minutes, is the solution still viable?" Chloe looked into the eyes of the man who ran the city's police force and saw only a terrified father. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus through the trauma of her assault. "The compounds are highly volatile. They require a strict storage temperature of exactly 4 degrees Celsius. When he shattered the lock and pried it open, the ambient humidity and temperature compromised the sterile environment. However," she paused, her clinical training desperately trying to override her panic. "There are 4 vials. If the ambient temperature of the storm kept the core temperature of the fluid low enough, and if the stopper on at least 1 vial remained perfectly intact without condensation, Dr. Pendleton might be able to salvage enough to initiate the bypass." It was a razor-thin margin of hope, but it was all they had. "Sergeant," Hayes roared, "tell that retrieval team to drive like the devil himself is chasing them." Meanwhile, 3 miles away at Seattle Presbyterian Hospital, Surgical Theater 3 was descending into a controlled, terrifying chaos. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a world-renowned pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, stood scrubbed in, his gloved hands resting on the sterile drapes covering 8-year-old Madison Hayes. The donor heart, a perfect tissue match that had taken 14 agonizing months to locate, was currently resting in a specialized cooler in the corner of the room. It had less than 45 minutes of ischemic time remaining before the cardiac tissue began to die irrecoverably. "Arthur, we are losing our window," Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead anesthesiologist, warned softly, his eyes glued to the vital monitors. "If we don't begin the induction and put her on the cardiopulmonary bypass machine now, we are going to have to abort the transplant." "We cannot abort, Eris," Dr. Pendleton said, his voice tight behind his surgical mask. "She won't survive another week, let alone another year waiting for a match. We have to bridge her. Without the specialized cardioplegia, it's suicide," another surgeon countered. "The proprietary mixture Chloe was bringing prevents the intracellular calcium overload. If we use the standard pediatric solution on this specific donor heart, the risk of massive reperfusion injury and immediate organ failure is over 80%. Then we fight the 80%, Dr. Pendleton stated, his eyes dark with grim determination. "Prepare the standard Del Nido cardioplegia solution. We are going to put her on ECMO, cool her core temperature down to 26 degrees, and pray that Chloe's team can salvage the proprietary vials before we finish the anastomosis." It was a terrifying gamble, a desperate surgical Hail Mary forced entirely by the ignorance of one police officer. Back on Route 119, a convoy of state trooper vehicles tore through the rain, their sirens wailing like banshees in the night. They located Chloe's abandoned silver Honda Civic on the muddy shoulder. The passenger door was still slightly ajar, the rain pouring directly into the vehicle. A specialized medical retrieval technician, wearing thermal gloves, sprinted to the car. He carefully lifted the shattered lid of the cooler. The digital thermometer on the side of the box, which should have read a steady 4 degrees Celsius, was flashing a warning red. 11.2 degrees Celsius. Temperature limit exceeded. The technician radioed in, his stomach dropping. He pulled out a specialized thermal scanner and scanned the 4 glass vials. 3 of them had condensation rapidly forming on the inside of the glass, rendering the delicate enzymes useless and potentially toxic. But the 4th vial, nestled deepest in the specialized foam and shielded from the direct wind, scanned at a slightly cooler 6.1 degrees Celsius. Command: this is Retrieval 1. 3 vials are compromised. We have 1 vial that is borderline. I am transferring it to a portable cryochamber now. ETA to Seattle Presbyterian is 6 minutes. In the holding cell of the 42nd Precinct, Bradley Jenkins sat on the hard concrete bench, his head in his hands. The heavy steel door was locked tight. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his uniform confiscated as evidence. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had ignited a bomb that was currently leveling his entire existence. He could hear the frantic radios of the officers outside, broadcasting the play-by-play of the desperate race to save the commissioner's daughter. Every time the radio crackled, Bradley flinched, knowing that if that little girl died, he would be facing a mountain of federal charges, to say nothing of the unofficial wrath of the entire Seattle police apparatus. Karma had not just caught up to him, it had trapped him in a cage of his own making. The dawn broke over Seattle in a wash of dreary gray, the violent storm leaving behind flooded streets and a city completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding within its medical and law enforcement communities. But in the modern age, secrets of this magnitude do not stay buried long. By 7:00 a.m., the story had leaked. It started with a frantic anonymous tip from a nurse at Seattle Presbyterian to a local investigative journalist, detailing the chaotic, near-fatal emergency surgery of the police commissioner's daughter. Within an hour, the police scanner audio from Bradley's initial traffic stop and his subsequent boastful radio calls were pulled and authenticated. By 9:00 a.m., the headline blared across every major news network and social media platform in the Pacific Northwest. Arrogance over oath. Seattle cop arrests black nurse saving commissioner's daughter. Sabotages heart transplant. The public backlash was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The Seattle Police Department headquarters was swarmed by reporters, news vans, and outraged citizens. The narrative was a perfect, horrifying storm of systemic issues. A police officer with a history of excessive force complaints profiling a black medical professional, ignoring her frantic pleas, and ultimately destroying life-saving medical supplies out of pure ego and greed for a promotion. Inside the State Bureau of Investigation headquarters, a team of federal agents and top-tier internal affairs investigators had already seized Officer Bradley Jenkins' entire personnel file. Special Agent Thomas Vance, a ruthless, meticulous investigator from the Department of Justice, sat across from Bradley in a sterile interrogation room. Bradley looked entirely defeated. The bags under his eyes were deep purple, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. His union representative, a notoriously aggressive lawyer named Gregson, sat beside him, but even Gregson looked visibly nauseated by the facts of the case. Let's review the body cam footage. Officer Jenkins, Agent Vance said, his voice dangerously calm. He pressed play on a laptop facing the table. The screen flickered to life, showing the rain-slicked highway. The audio captured Chloe's desperate, frantic voice perfectly. Officer, please. I am so sorry I was speeding. I am a medical transport nurse for Seattle Presbyterian. I have an absolute emergency. I'm carrying... The video showed Bradley violently interrupting her, blinding her with the flashlight, and refusing to look at her prominently displayed hospital ID badge. It showed him shattering the medical lockbox. Vance paused the video. At what point in your training, Bradley, were you instructed to destroy a sealed, biohazard-marked medical container without calling in a hazmat or medical verification team? I believed it was a sophisticated concealment method for liquid fentanyl, Bradley whispered, staring at the table. Traffickers use fake medical boxes all the time. She was speeding. Acting erratically, she was terrified. And she was doing 75 to save a child's life, Vance interrupted, slamming a thick file onto the table. I pulled your record, Bradley. 5 complaints in the last 3 years. 3 for excessive use of force. 2 for racial profiling during traffic stops. Your precinct captain buried them because you met your quota for low-level narcotics arrests. You were hunting for a gold star to get your detective shield, and you didn't care who you had to run over to get it. My client acted on reasonable suspicion given the circumstances of the late-night traffic stop. Gregson interjected mechanically, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. Reasonable suspicion? Vance laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He left a civilian stranded on a dark highway in a torrential downpour, confiscated her legal vehicle, ignored her professional identification, and destroyed a proprietary $1 million medical compound. And here is the kicker, Gregson. Vance leaned across the table, his eyes drilling into Bradley. The district attorney is officially upgrading the charges. We are no longer just looking at official misconduct. You are being charged under the Federal Civil Rights Act for deprivation of rights under color of law. Furthermore, because your actions directly resulted in a critical medical emergency, the DA is preparing a charge of attempted manslaughter. Bradley's breath hitched in his throat. Attempted manslaughter? Yes, Vance said coldly, because as we sit here, Madison Hayes is on an ECMO machine in the pediatric intensive care unit. The single vial they managed to salvage from your little smash and grab was partially degraded. The surgical team had to use a dangerous alternative. Her new heart is failing to beat on its own. She is in critical condition. If she dies, Bradley, that charge immediately becomes depraved indifference murder. Bradley buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched sobbing groan. The walls of his reality had completely collapsed. There was no tough guy facade left. He was a man staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary. Simultaneously, at Seattle Presbyterian, the atmosphere in the pediatric ICU was agonizingly tense. Chloe Henderson sat in a rigid plastic chair outside Madison's glass-walled room. She had refused to go home. She had changed into a fresh set of scrubs, her raw, bruised wrists carefully bandaged by a sympathetic emergency room nurse. She stared unblinking at the young girl lying in the massive hospital bed, surrounded by a terrifying array of tubes, monitors, and the massive rhythmic pumping of the ECMO machine doing the work of her lungs and her new, struggling heart. Commissioner Hayes stood beside Chloe, leaning heavily against the glass. He had aged 10 years in a single night. She was so brave, Hayes whispered, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall mechanically. When they told her they had a heart, she wasn't scared. She just asked if she would finally be able to run in the park without getting tired. She still will, Chloe said, her voice fierce with conviction despite her own trauma. Dr. Pendleton is the best in the world, and Madison is fighting. Hayes turned to look at Chloe. He saw the bandages on her wrists. He saw the sheer exhaustion in her posture. Miss Henderson. Chloe, I don't have the words to apologize for what my department did to you tonight, Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion. You risked everything to save my little girl, and you were treated like a criminal by a man who had no business wearing that badge. I promise you, I will tear the rot out of my department by the roots. Jenkins will never see the outside of a cell, and anyone who enabled his behavior will be standing in the unemployment line by Friday. Chloe looked up at him. I don't care about his punishment right now, Commissioner. I only care about her heart. As if en quay, the heavy doors of the ICU swung open, and Dr. Arthur Pendleton walked in. He still wore his surgical cap, his surgical scrubs stained and rumpled. His face was a mask of sheer exhaustion, but as he approached the glass, a faint, trembling smile touched his lips. Arthur? Commissioner Hayes asked, his heart leaping into his throat. The myocardial edema is subsiding, Dr. Pendleton announced, his voice carrying the weight of a miracle. The single vial Chloe's team managed to salvage. It wasn't perfect, but it was just enough to give the tissue the chemical bridge it needed. We are going to begin weaning her off the ECMO machine in an hour. The new heart, it's starting to beat on its own. Commissioner Hayes collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands as loud, racking sobs of pure relief tore through his body. Chloe closed her eyes, letting a fresh wave of tears slide down her cheeks. The nightmare wasn't over. The legal battles, the trauma, the media circus, all of that was waiting for her tomorrow. But in this exact moment, in the quiet hum of the ICU, karma had delivered its ultimate verdict. The arrogant officer was locked in a cage, his life ruined by his own hubris, while the nurse he had tried to destroy sat in the presence of a miracle she had helped secure. 6 months after the torrential storm that nearly cost an 8-year-old girl her life, the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle became the epicenter of the most highly publicized civil rights and medical negligence trial of the decade. The city had not forgotten the harrowing audio of a desperate nurse begging for a child's life, nor the arrogant, dismissive sneer of the man who chose his ego over his sworn duty. Officer Bradley Jenkins, now stripped of his title, his uniform, and his freedom, sat at the defense table. He was a hollowed-out shell of the imposing, aggressive cop who had patrolled Route 119. The 6 months spent in solitary confinement, a necessity due to the massive target on his back from both inmates and disgusted corrections officers, had drained him of his color and his toxic bravado. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit, his eyes constantly darting around the packed courtroom, avoiding the heavy, condemning stares of the gallery. Presiding over the case was Federal Judge Harrison Caldwell, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for police corruption. The prosecution was led by United States Attorney Madeline Frost, a formidable litigator who had built her career dismantling corrupt institutions. Bradley's defense attorney desperately attempted to paint the incident as a tragic, adrenaline-fueled misunderstanding. He argued that Bradley was operating in a high-crime area, under severe weather conditions, and had made a split-second, albeit catastrophic, judgment call regarding a suspicious container. Madeline Frost methodically, surgically, tore that defense to absolute shreds. She summoned the hazmat technicians who had retrieved the shattered lockbox. They testified to the immense physical force required to break the reinforced thermal seal force that went far beyond a standard search and crossed into malicious destruction. She brought in Dr. Arthur Pendleton, who explained in agonizing clinical detail exactly what happened to a pediatric heart when deprived of the proprietary cardioplegia solution. He described the terrifying moments in the operating room, the immediate organ failure they had braced for, and the sheer, blind luck that one partially viable vial had survived the ambient temperature of the storm. But the most devastating moment of the trial came when Chloe Henderson took the witness stand. Wearing a simple professional navy blazer, Chloe looked composed, but the trauma of that night still lingered in her steady gaze. As she recounted the events on the shoulder of the highway, the courtroom fell into a deathly silence. The prosecution played the body cam footage again on the massive screens facing the jury. The audio echoed off the oak-paneled walls, the sound of Bradley laughing at Chloe's desperate pleas, the sickening crack of his flashlight smashing the $1 million medical cooler, and his boastful radio call to dispatch. "Miss Henderson?" Attorney Frost asked gently, breaking the heavy silence after the video ended. "When you told Mr. Jenkins that a little girl was going to die if you didn't reach the hospital, did he ask for any verification? Did he look at the medical badge clipped to your uniform?" "No," Chloe answered, her voice ringing clear and strong with irrefutable truth. "He told me to save my performance. He told me he had been doing this too long, to be played by street trash. He never looked at my ID. He never cared." When the jury retreated to deliberate, it took them less than 4 hours to reach a consensus. The courtroom was entirely silent as the foreperson stood up. Bradley Jenkins squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. And on the charge of attempted manslaughter in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." A collective shuddering breath swept through the room. Commissioner Richard Hayes, sitting in the front row with his wife Rebecca, buried his face in his hands, weeping silently. Judge Caldwell did not wait for a separate sentencing hearing. He looked down at Bradley with a gaze of unyielding ice. "Mr. Jenkins, you were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you used them as tools of intimidation, driven by a repulsive cocktail of racial prejudice, breathtaking arrogance, and selfish ambition," Judge Caldwell stated, his voice booming through the microphone. "You did not just assault a dedicated medical professional. You reached into an operating room and nearly extinguished the life of an innocent child. You are a disgrace to the badge, to your city, and to basic human decency." The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin slamming shut. Bradley Jenkins was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. But the karma did not stop with Bradley. Following the trial, Commissioner Hayes launched an unprecedented, ruthless purge of the Seattle Police Department. Captain Thomas Gregory, the precinct commander who had spent years burying Bradley's excessive force complaints to artificially inflate his precinct's narcotic arrest statistics, was dishonorably fired, publicly disgraced, and stripped of his entire state pension. 4 other officers who had enabled the toxic culture of the 42nd Precinct were permanently relieved of duty. The institutional rot that had allowed a monster like Bradley to thrive was violently excavated and destroyed. A year and a half after the storm, the afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Discovery Park. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the distant, soothing roll of the Puget Sound. Chloe Henderson sat on a wooden park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, watching a chaotic, joyful game of tag unfolding on the expansive green lawn. "She's too fast for him," a deep, warm voice said. Chloe smiled as Commissioner Richard Hayes sat down beside her, dressed in a casual sweater and jeans, looking years younger than the terrified man she had met in the precinct. They both watched as 10-year-old Madison Hayes sprinted across the grass, her laughter carrying on the wind, easily outrunning her older brother. Madison was a picture of radiant health. The color in her cheeks was vibrant, her energy boundless. The new heart beating in her chest had integrated perfectly, a medical miracle achieved through the bleeding edge of science and the relentless courage of the woman sitting on the bench. "Doctor, Pendleton said her latest echocardiogram was flawless," Richard said, his eyes misting over slightly as he watched his daughter run. "She has 0 restrictions. She wants to join the track team next spring. She's going to leave them all in the dust." Chloe laughed softly. Chloe's life had fundamentally shifted since that horrific night. The hospital administration, recognizing her unparalleled dedication and the profound trauma she had endured for her patients, had promoted her. She was now the director of pediatric transport logistics for the entire Pacific Northwest region, overseeing a massive fleet of helicopters, ambulances, and specialized medical couriers. She had completely rewritten the protocols for medical transport interactions with law enforcement, partnering directly with the newly reformed police academy to ensure that no officer would ever repeat Bradley's fatal mistake. "We can never repay you, Chloe," Richard said quietly, turning to look at her. "Every single time I hear her laugh, I know it is a sound that exists solely because you refuse to give up." "I was just doing my job, Richard," Chloe replied humbly, watching Madison tackle her brother to the grass. "I just wanted to make sure she got the chance to grow up." Far away from the sunlight and the laughter of Discovery Park, the reality of karma played out in a stark, agonizing contrast. 2 states over, within the towering concrete walls of the Florence Federal Correctional Complex, Bradley Jenkins was living out the devastating consequences of his hubris. The former police officer was now inmate 88492. Stripped of all power and authority, he spent his days in the claustrophobic confines of a high-security cell block. His existence was reduced to a rigid, terrifying routine dictated by the prison guards, men who looked at him with the exact same disdain he had once reserved for the citizens he had sworn to protect. He was entirely alone. His fiancée had left him before the trial even concluded. His former brothers in blue had completely erased him from their memories. Every night, as the heavy steel doors slammed shut, echoing down the cold concrete blocks, Bradley was left with nothing but the suffocating silence and the crushing weight of his own profound failure. He had sacrificed his freedom, his reputation, and his life for a promotion he never deserved. Back in the park, Madison suddenly broke away from her brother and sprinted toward the bench. She crashed into Chloe, throwing her small arms tightly around the nurse's neck. "Auntie Chloe, did you see how fast I ran?" Madison beamed, her chest heaving with healthy, strong breaths. Chloe hugged the little girl back, feeling the steady, powerful, and miraculous thumping of Madison's heart against her own chest. It was a rhythm of victory, a testament to resilience. "I saw you, Maddie," Chloe smiled, a profound sense of peace settling over her soul. "You were flying." The story of the arrogant officer and the unwavering nurse serves as a chilling, real-life testament to the catastrophic dangers of unchecked authority and the brutal, inescapable precision of karma. In a single night, a routine power trip morphed into a desperate fight for survival, proving that the uniforms we wear do not dictate our morality. Our actions do. Bradley Jenkins believed his badge made him invincible, blind to the fact that his prejudice was actively sabotaging a medical miracle. He built his own cage out of hubris and ignorance. Meanwhile, Chloe Henderson's fierce dedication transformed a night of profound trauma into a lifetime of hope for a young girl. This narrative strips away the illusion of systemic invulnerability, reminding us that justice, while sometimes delayed, strikes with devastating finality when humanity's most vulnerable are put on the line. In the end, arrogance was buried in concrete, while courage was rewarded with the beautiful, enduring rhythm of a beating heart.